After 2 years and a day of nearly continuous fighting, Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire. In a deal signed yesterday at a conference in Egypt, the Netanyahu government and the leadership of Hamas came to a key series of agreements that will draw down hostilities and place the Middle East on track to finally establish a permanent peace. Within the next several days, Israel will retreat its forces across much of the Gaza Strip, Hamas will release its last group of living hostages, and humanitarian aid will finally surge into a war zone where it is desperately needed. For the first time in many months, there is genuine cause for optimism on the Israel-Hamas conflict, and with a whole lot of luck, this ceasefire could lead to an extended period of peace and reconstruction. But if peace truly is on the horizon, it's not going to happen by accident. Israel and Hamas are going to have to make peace, first by holding to this ceasefire, and then by working their way through the massive enduring issues that still stand in the way. The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is an immensely positive sign, but it is not the end of the story, and it's what Israel and Hamas do with the new ceasefire that will determine whether the people of Israel and the people of Gaza can finally return to a life without war.
And now a quick word from our sponsor, me, or more precisely, my website, fronts.co. Have you ever found yourself thinking, there's just not enough content on WarFronts. 6 videos a week is just not enough for me. I want the world to be crazier. I want more war, more death. Well, 1, what's wrong with you? And 2, well, great news. Extra WarFronts content is now at your fingertips over at fronts.co. Look at that. Yes, starting this very week, we'll be posting 2 exclusive videos every week to our new subscriber-only website, fronts.co. For just $5 a month, you'll gain access to brand new WarFronts content that won't be available on YouTube. Our first videos are already up, exploring topics as timely as whether Poland could win a war against Russia, and as timeless as how South Korea came to build the best tank on Earth. And to sweeten the deal, we're also asking our writers to contribute 2 in-depth written articles each week, exploring some unusual or less appreciated angle on geopolitics and warfare. So, not only will you get more of the videos you love, you'll also get a chance to read some of our writers' unfiltered takes on war news. So look, if you like this channel, you'll love fronts.co. Again, $5 a month. It helps support us here at Fronts, WarFronts, Political Fronts, and fronts.co. And nothing is changing here. I have learned from the mistakes of past YouTubers. We are not doing a paywall on any existing content. The 6 videos a week will be here for you just as before. It's all just gravy, baby. Don't know why I went all Austin Powers there. But yeah, fronts.co. Just go there. Good domain, right? It was expensive.
Okay, so before we begin today's episode, quick word about timing, because even with both Israel and Hamas signaling their support of the ceasefire, the situation across the Middle East is very fluid. As such, everything that we discuss in this episode is accurate to the best of our knowledge and ability through the start of day on October the 10th, local time in Jerusalem and Gaza City. Anything that's happened after that time won't be accounted for over the course of the discussion, although you can rest assured that if anything really major does take place, we're of course going to come back and cover it. Now, the talks that led to the new ceasefire between Israel and Hamas have gone on for weeks, but it was only over the last few days that the world started to sense a breakthrough. High-level American officials descended on the scene of negotiations, Middle Eastern leaders tightened the screws on Hamas's leaders behind the scenes, and by the late hours of Wednesday evening, it had become clear that an announcement was imminent. Within the span of just hours, the respective leadership of Israel and Hamas had each confirmed that they had accepted a set of terms. The agreement was formalized the following day when representatives of each group signed the deal in Egypt. The deal commits Israel and Hamas to participation in the first phase of what's expected to be a multi-stage ceasefire, with negotiations on the following stages set to continue. As of the time of writing, the full text of the agreement hasn't yet been released to the global public. But, according to reports from outlets across the world, the first phase seems to revolve around 3 key provisions. First, Israel and Hamas will mutually engage in an exchange of prisoners, with Hamas committing to release all 20 of its remaining living Israeli hostages in one go. There will not be any of the inflammatory ceremonies that Hamas has organized around prior releases. In return, Israel is expected to release around 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, including over 1,700 who were detained in the Gaza Strip, and 250 Palestinians currently serving life sentences in Israeli custody. The remaining deceased Israeli hostages will be released as they become available, although, as of now, Hamas states that some of those remains have still yet to be collected. Also, as part of the deal, Israeli forces have agreed to a phased withdrawal from parts of the Gaza Strip, although its forces will remain present in some areas. According to Washington, Israel will withdraw to about 58% of Gaza's territory in total, instead of the more than 80% of Gaza that Israel controlled the day it agreed to the ceasefire. On Thursday, an Israeli spokesperson suggested that Israel may occupy closer to 53% of Gaza, although the reason for the discrepancy was unclear. Under Washington's specifications, Israel will maintain its presence in most of Rafah and a majority of Khan Yunis, as well as several other areas that used to be densely populated Gaza neighborhoods. Israel will retain control of all border access points, and although it's not explicitly covered in the ceasefire, it's unlikely that Gazans will be immediately able to return to the areas that they used to call home. Israel and Hamas will both commit to a full stop to the fighting. Finally, Israel is expected to allow at least 400 aid trucks to surge into Gaza almost immediately, and then allow aid to regularly flow into Gaza from that point forward at the rate of about 600 aid trucks a day. That's enough to match the pre-war needs of Gaza's population and start to refill stocks of critical supplies like fuel, medicine, and hospital supplies. So, now that Israel and Hamas have formally agreed to the ceasefire, the first step will be to actually stop fighting, something that has not actually happened at the time we're putting this episode together. Although Israeli forces ended hostilities in most areas, intermittent explosions rang out across Gaza all day on Thursday, including in multiple zones in the central and southern regions. According to Israeli sources, those strikes only hit targets that posed an imminent threat to Israeli troops as they repositioned, while the daily death toll reported by the authorities in Gaza was unusually low, but not zero. According to the count released on Thursday, 11 bodies were brought to hospitals in the prior 24 hours and 49 other people were counted as wounded. The Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, confirmed on Thursday that they're preparing to transition towards strictly defensive lines as the ceasefire takes effect. And then there's the release of the living hostages, which is expected to take place within a 72-hour window that starts when Israel signed the deal. That window will close on Monday, so Hamas is expected to release all 20 hostages by or before then. They will be brought to 3 hospitals near Tel Aviv, where they'll be evaluated, nourished, and reunited with their loved ones. As for the bodies of deceased hostages, it's not clear when all of them will be returned or how many will be returned in the coming few days, but international observers have stressed that the process could take weeks or even months. The locations of some of the hostage bodies aren't currently known, partly because the Hamas members responsible for keeping track of them have, in some cases, been killed. 28 bodies of hostages are still thought to be located in Gaza. In return, Hamas has submitted a list of the prisoners that it wishes to see released. Israel will publish that list, and people who have been victimized by attacks that those prisoners perpetrated will have 24 hours to make their objections known. Several names that are expected to be on Hamas's list are also expected to be a point of contention, especially Marwan al-Barghouti, who Palestinians consistently identify as their preferred head of state in a hypothetical sovereign nation, and former militant leader Ahmed Sadat. Israel has already stated that it will not allow Barghouti's release. Meanwhile, the United Nations will help to surge aid into the Gaza Strip, an initiative that UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres has indicated that the UN is prepared to start immediately. By the estimates of the UN's emergency aid chief, there are 170,000 tons of aid already prepared to flow immediately into the territory, and that aid is desperately needed. According to a Wednesday study published in The Lancet, almost 55,000 children under the age of 6 are thought to be acutely malnourished across Gaza. After the early phases of implementation are complete, Israel, Hamas, and their international mediators will turn their attention toward future stages of the ceasefire deal, probably engaging around the terms of the 20-point peace plan that the Trump administration laid out in late September. The deal calls for Israel to grant amnesty to Hamas members and for those ex-militants and the rest of the Gaza population to be offered safe passage abroad if they'd like to leave the territory. In exchange, Hamas will disarm voluntarily and will not be allowed to participate in the future administration of the Gaza Strip, either directly or indirectly. Under the plan, the Gazan reconstruction will begin and the territory's residents will not be forced to leave against their will, contradicting prior plans for which Trump has voiced his support. Israel will be barred from occupying or annexing Gaza, while the territory will be temporarily administered by a, quote, technocratic and apolitical Palestinian committee, managed in turn by an international board of overseers that will be led by Trump himself. Of course, there's a lot of ambition tied up in all of those objectives, and it should be transparently obvious that some points of Trump's plan will be very difficult to achieve under even the best of circumstances. But whether that plan is held constant, whether it's modified or renegotiated, or whether it's abandoned in favor of another framework are questions that will be hammered out between the negotiating teams as this ceasefire process moves forward. Now, of course, we couldn't conclude this episode without at least some discussion of the many sticking points that still remain. Remember, this is a Phase 1 ceasefire deal, not a comprehensive peace accord, and either Hamas or Israel or both could reverse course at any time and for a wide range of different reasons. In fact, it's entirely possible that the ceasefire could fall apart before you even see this episode, and while we don't expect that to happen, the lack of a diplomatic breakdown so far does not imply that a diplomatic breakdown isn't a real possibility. We'll start on the side of Hamas, where, first, there are the implications of Hamas's choice to return its remaining hostages, and, if it does as promised, to return the bodies of the deceased as soon as possible. For Hamas, releasing the hostages means taking a massive risk, and one that both Hamas and Israel fully understand. The prospect that Israel could secure the release of the hostages eventually, or that the hostages could be killed by Hamas or Israeli fire, has given Hamas most of the leverage that it wields against Jerusalem. With the hostages returned, Hamas hopes that Israel will no longer have sufficient pretext to continue the war, and the organization has implored Washington to ensure that Israel is kept in line and made to stick to its commitments. But if the Netanyahu government chooses to continue the war anyway, and to pursue the total destruction of Hamas that Netanyahu has treated as a critical wartime objective, then Hamas will have a much more difficult time forcing Israel back to the negotiating table. And even if Netanyahu doesn't currently intend to return to war once the hostages are home, there are several outstanding issues that won't be addressed in this phase of negotiations. Hamas hasn't yet agreed to disarm, which Israel considers to be mandatory for a lasting peace, and Hamas certainly hasn't endorsed the part of Trump's plan in which Hamas has no role in a post-war Gaza. Already on Thursday, a senior Hamas official told Qatari media that the group will reject the idea of an international board of peace to oversee reconstruction. Then there's the question of the bodies of the deceased hostages, where it's entirely possible that Hamas genuinely cannot find and return some of them. How long will Israel be willing to wait for a resolution before deciding that Hamas must be stalling and thus choosing to reopen the conflict? Or what if Israel doesn't agree to release the prisoners that Hamas is asking for? How massive of a sticking point could that become? What if Hamas finds that it can't control some of the most radical fighters within its ranks, or that it can't control its armed affiliates like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad? As for Israel, the political fate of Prime Minister Netanyahu is likely to be an outsized factor in whatever comes next. Israel is expected to hold elections no later than October 2026, although those elections could happen sooner if Netanyahu's government were to collapse, and the combination of war weariness, disillusionment with Netanyahu's leadership, and other domestic factors may be enough to see Netanyahu lose his position. Israel's premier is the consummate political survivor, and by the estimation of many experts inside and outside of Israel, his desire to maintain a hold on power and avoid the specter of a corruption trial has been a large part of why the war in Gaza has lasted so long. His coalition also exists at the pleasure of far-right leaders who could abandon him if Israel were to commit to a peace that they oppose. On the other hand, that could incentivize Netanyahu to return to war with Hamas once Israel's hostages have come home in order to extend his mandate even further and try to garner popular support. Or it could incentivize Netanyahu to consider a possibility we discussed at length in the previous episode that we actually published yesterday, written before the news that a ceasefire could be imminent. After their 12-day conflict earlier this year, Israel and Iran both seem to be preparing for a return to conflict, and in prior periods of ceasefire in Gaza, Netanyahu has turned Israel's attention toward Iran and other proxy militant groups that Iran supports. Twisted as it may be, an enduring peace in Gaza may make a wider war with Iran more likely, not less, if, indeed, Netanyahu sees a war effort as his best shot at remaining premier. According to insider reports, Netanyahu was under heavy pressure to accept this deal, especially from the United States, suggesting that if he had been allowed to act upon his own political calculus in this moment, a ceasefire probably wouldn't be happening. Beyond Netanyahu himself, it's not clear that the Israeli public would accept many of the terms in the peace accord proposed by Trump, particularly the stipulation for Hamas fighters to be granted amnesty and for Israel to avoid occupying or annexing the Gaza Strip. Annexation is a very politically sensitive issue with plenty of staunch opponents inside Israel, but Israel is in a political moment where small, pro-annexation political parties maintain a controlling influence over domestic policy. Israel's far-right finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, is a critical ally of Netanyahu and expressed in the wake of the ceasefire that he and his religious Zionism party would fiercely oppose an end to the war. On social media, Smotrich explained that he hopes that, quote, immediately after the hostages return home, the state of Israel will continue to strive with all its might for the true eradication of Hamas and the genuine disarmament of Gaza so that it no longer poses a threat to Israel. Another far-right leader, Minister for National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir, expressed agreement while offering a direct threat to Netanyahu, quoting him, "We are happy about the release of all hostages, but we will vote against the release of murderers. The Prime Minister committed to me that Hamas will be dismantled. If it doesn't happen, we will dismantle the government." And even for relative moderates in Israel, the idea that Hamas fighters would be granted amnesty and given safe passage to any place across the globe that they'd like to go to would be a difficult prospect to stomach. As always, the global Jewish population faces the threat of random anti-Semitic attacks all over the world, while it wouldn't necessarily be a shock to see ex-Hamas militants fall in with other forms of radical ideology abroad, or even take up arms alongside other Iran-backed proxy groups. Luckily, those are all tomorrow's problems, and today we finally get to enjoy a bit of good news coming out of the Middle East. And yes, absolutely knock on wood right now. What happens next in Gaza, in Israel, and across the entire region, we'll have to wait and find out. But at least for today, the fighting in Gaza is over. We can only hope that somehow it stays that way. Thank you for watching.